My name is Naomi Carter, and I want to start this story by telling you something that took me 11 years to understand. There is a very thin line between a man who loves you and a man who owns you. And the terrifying thing is that when you are living inside that line, you cannot always see it. You think you are being loved. You think you are being protected. You think the man who checks your phone every night before you go to bed does it because he cares. And you think the man who tells you what to wear to your own sister's wedding does it because he has taste. And you think the man who handles all the finances and never gives you a bank statement does it because he is responsible. And you think all of these things because you want to think them, because the alternative is something so painful and so terrifying that your mind simply refuses to go there for a very long time. And then one day, something small happens. Not a big thing, not a dramatic moment. Something so small that you almost miss it, and that small thing cracks everything open. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with a villain. It starts the way all the most dangerous stories start, with a man who seemed, in every possible way, like a dream. I met Marcus Carter when I was 23 years old, at a gallery opening in the city. I had gone with my best friend Simone, who was an assistant to one of the artists showing that night, and I remember standing in front of a painting I didn't fully understand, holding a glass of wine, trying to look like I belonged in a room full of people who definitely earned more money than I did. And then Marcus appeared at my left shoulder and said very quietly, "It's about grief. The painter lost her mother 3 weeks before she finished it. You can see it in the red. It's too heavy. Grief always makes red look heavier." And I turned and looked at him, and I thought, this man is different. This man sees things other people don't see. And I was right. He did see things. I just didn't understand yet exactly what kind of things he was looking at. Marcus was 31 at the time. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that could have been sculpted, and eyes the color of dark amber that had a way of making you feel, when they landed on you, like you were the most interesting person in any room. He wore clothes that fit him perfectly. He spoke in complete sentences. He remembered details. He would ask you something at the beginning of a conversation and circle back to it an hour later, weaving it into something new, and you would feel seen in a way that was almost startling. He was a financial consultant with his own firm, successful and respected, and he had this quiet authority about him that was magnetic in a way I had never experienced before. My previous relationships had been with boys, fumbling, uncertain, apologetic boys. Marcus was not a boy. Marcus was a man. And in the beginning, that felt like the most wonderful thing in the world. We dated for 14 months before he proposed, and those 14 months were some of the most intoxicating of my life. He took me to restaurants I had never heard of and ordered things off the menu in French and explained to me, gently and without condescension, or at least what I interpreted as without condescension, what everything was. He took me to concerts and museums and weekend trips to cities I had always wanted to visit, and he held my hand in the car and kissed me at traffic lights and told me, often, that he had been waiting his whole life to find someone like me. He met my mother, Diane, and charmed her completely, and she pulled me aside at dinner one night and whispered, "Baby, that man is a keeper." And I held on to those words like a life raft for years. Years, even when I should have let them go. The first sign came so early that I almost didn't recognize it as a sign at all. We had been dating for about 4 months when we were getting ready to go to a birthday party for his colleague, and I came out of the bedroom in a red dress, a dress I loved, a dress I felt beautiful in, and Marcus looked at me for a long moment and said, "You might want to change." I asked why. He said, "You look incredible, but these are work people, and I need them to take me seriously, and a red dress sends a message." I stood there for a moment, feeling something shift in my chest, some small thing that I could not name, and then I went back and changed into a navy wrap dress that he approved of with a nod. And I told myself, he knows these people. He knows this world. He is looking out for me. And I believed that. I genuinely believed that. Because it is so easy to mistake control for care when the control is wrapped in the right language. We got engaged on a Tuesday night in October on the rooftop of the building where we had our first dinner date, and it was perfect. The city spread out below us, lights like scattered diamonds, a ring that was exactly what I would have chosen for myself. I said yes immediately, without hesitation. And I called Simone from the elevator on the way down and screamed into the phone, and she screamed back. And I was so happy. I want to be clear about that. I was genuinely, completely, full-body happy in that moment. Not performing happiness, not convincing myself. Actually happy. That matters, because what came later doesn't erase what was real, but it also doesn't excuse it. We got married the following June. Our wedding was beautiful, and I want to say that because it's true. It was genuinely beautiful, and I chose almost nothing about it. Marcus had opinions about everything. The venue, the flowers, the menu, the band, the guest list, the seating arrangement, the timeline, the photographer. Every time I suggested something different, there would be this slight pause, this almost imperceptible hesitation, and then he would say something like, "Are you sure about that?" I was thinking. And then he would present his version, and his version was always more confident, more fully formed, more certain than mine, and I would look at it next to my idea, and mine would suddenly seem smaller, less sure of itself, and I would say, "Actually, you know what? Your idea is better." And it wasn't always untrue. Some of his ideas were better. But the habit of deferring to him, that was something I was building, brick by brick, without realizing I was building anything at all. The first year of marriage was fine, mostly. There were patterns forming that I didn't yet have the language to describe. He handled the finances entirely. Both our salaries went into a joint account that only he had the card for, and I had a separate account with what he called spending money, a weekly transfer that was enough for groceries and small personal items. I worked full-time as a graphic designer at a mid-size agency, and I was good at my job, and I made a real salary, and yet somehow I was operating on an allowance. I told myself this was organization. I told myself this was efficiency. I told myself that Marcus was good with money in a way that I wasn't, which was true. He was good with money. But I didn't stop to ask myself what it cost me to never know what was in our bank account, to never know what we owed on the mortgage, to never see a statement. I didn't ask because when I thought about asking, there was this small but very real sense that it would upset something, that it would open a conversation I wasn't prepared to have. And so I didn't ask, and the not asking became its own kind of habit. By the second year, the patterns were more pronounced. He wanted to know where I was at all times, not in an aggressive way, not in a way that I could point to and say, "This is surveillance," more like a steady stream of check-ins. "Where are you? When will you be home? Who is that you're texting?" Said with a smile, said with a laugh sometimes, said in ways that let him deny, always, that he was doing what he was doing. My friendship started to narrow. Simone noticed it first. She told me once, over lunch, one of our lunches that Marcus had made a passing comment about, something like, "You two spend a lot of time together for two grown women," said with a laugh, said like a joke. She told me, "Naomi, I feel like I only see you when he's traveling." And I got defensive. I actually got defensive, sitting across from my oldest friend, the woman who had known me since we were 11 years old. And I said, "Marcus doesn't stop me from seeing you." And she looked at me with these patient, careful eyes and said, "I know he doesn't stop you." And I didn't understand what she meant. I didn't understand for a long time. By year 3, I had stopped suggesting things, not because he had ever exploded or threatened or screamed. Marcus was not that kind of man. He was the other kind, which is in many ways more insidious because you can't point to it. You can't show someone a bruise. You can't play a recording of him screaming and say, look what he does." Instead, you have a man who sighs, a man who says, "I just worry about you sometimes." A man who says, "You always do this," in a tone that makes you feel like you have a recurring flaw that only he can see and only he is patient enough to manage. A man who gives you a look when you say something at a dinner party that he later, in the car on the way home, describes as a little much. I had stopped suggesting things because suggesting things meant the potential for that look, that sigh, that gentle, devastating sentence that would make me feel both corrected and grateful for the correction. It was easier to wait, to watch him and figure out what he wanted and give it to him before he had to ask. Because when I gave it to him before he had to ask, he was warm and generous and loving in a way that felt like the sun coming out. And I had become a person who organized her entire existence around keeping the sun out. Let me tell you about the moment that cracked everything open, because it was so small. It was a Thursday evening in early March, and I was in the kitchen making dinner, and my phone buzzed on the counter, and it was a text from a number I didn't recognize. The text said, "Hi, this is Keisha from the Johnson account. I have your business card from the conference last year. Would you be open to a freelance project?" I had gone to a design conference the previous year. Marcus had not been happy about it. There had been a 2-day coldness before he came around, and I had handed out business cards the way you do, the way any professional person does, and I had mostly forgotten about it. And this text, this completely ordinary professional text, caused something to happen inside me that I cannot fully explain. I stood in my kitchen, and I thought, I have to ask him if I can take this project. And then immediately, before that thought was even fully formed, another thought came behind it, quieter and more devastating. Why do I have to ask him? And I stood very still for a very long moment, and I felt something rearrange itself in my chest, like furniture being moved in a room that has been the same for years. And I thought, when did I become someone who has to ask her husband for permission to do her job? I didn't answer Keisha's text that night. I waited until the next morning when Marcus had left for work, and I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, and I called Simone, and I told her about the text, and I told her about the thought that had come after it, and there was a silence on the other end of the line. And then Simone said, very carefully, "Naomi, I've been waiting for you to call me about something like this for about 2 years." And I started to cry, not because of the text, not because of Marcus. I cried because of all the small things that had led to this moment, all the dresses I had changed out of, and the suggestions I had swallowed, and the friends I had quietly drifted away from, and the professional opportunities I had not pursued. And I could feel the weight of all of them at once, pressing down on me. And I understood, sitting at that kitchen table with my coffee going cold, that I had been disappearing slowly, so slowly I hadn't noticed, until one small text from a woman I had barely met showed me exactly how much of myself was already gone. But here is the thing you need to understand, the thing that makes this story different from what you might expect. I did not leave, not immediately, not dramatically. Because the situation was more complicated than that, and because I was smarter than that, and because I had been in that kitchen for 6 years, and I knew exactly how Marcus Carter operated, and I decided that if I was going to rebuild myself, I was going to have to be very, very careful about how I did it. I decided, sitting at that table, that I was not going to run. I was going to walk. And while I was walking, I was going to let Marcus believe that everything was exactly as it had always been. I was going to let him believe he had won. And that decision, quiet, calculated, born in a kitchen on a Thursday morning, was the beginning of the most important year of my life. I answered Keisha's text. I told her I would be happy to discuss the project. I set the meeting for a Tuesday afternoon when Marcus was in back-to-back client meetings and would not notice the gap in my location updates. I met Keisha, a woman about 5 years younger than me, confident and clear-eyed and impossibly organized, at a coffee shop downtown, and we talked for an hour and a half, and she offered me a 6-week freelance contract that would pay me more per project than I made in 2 months at my agency job. I said yes. I took the contract. I told Marcus I was working late on a new campaign. And I want to be honest, lying to him felt wrong. It felt uncomfortable and contrary to every value I had. But I also understood that I was not lying to a partner. I was lying to a system. I was lying to 6 years of accumulated control that had convinced me I needed permission to breathe, and I gave myself enough grace to hold both of those truths at once. The money from Keisha's project went into an account Marcus didn't know existed. I had opened it 3 weeks after that kitchen table morning at a bank branch 2 neighborhoods over from ours, paying the opening deposit in cash from money I had quietly been saving for 4 months. Small amounts, $5 here, $10 there, the kind of amounts that don't show up in any pattern, the kind of amounts that a man who has taught himself to see everything might miss. It was not enough money to change my life. But it was enough money to make me feel, for the first time in a very long time, that I had a life to change. I also started therapy. This required its own kind of strategy. I found a therapist named Dr. Patricia Wells, a black woman in her early 60s who had an office near the agency and who I told Marcus I was seeing for work stress. He seemed, if anything, slightly pleased by this, as though it confirmed something he had always thought about my capacity to handle pressure. He asked me once how the sessions were going, and I said, "She's really helping me think more clearly," and he nodded approvingly, and I had to work very hard not to smile, because Dr. Wells was indeed helping me think more clearly. Just not about work stress. Dr. Wells was the first person who gave me the word coercive control. She said it in our 3rd session, quietly, without drama, the way you would name a plant in a garden. This is what this is called. I had never heard the term before. I looked it up that night, sitting in my car in the parking garage so that there was no browser history on our home network, and I read about it for 2 hours, and I felt something I can only describe as the world tilting on its axis. Because every item on every list, every pattern described in every article, was my marriage. Not a version of it, not an approximation. My actual marriage, described by strangers on the internet with a precision that was both validating and shattering. For the next 4 months, I became a student of my own life. I watched Marcus the way you watch something you are trying to understand, not with anger, but with clarity. I noticed the mechanics of it. The way he would begin sentences with, "I just think," before redirecting something I had said. The way he would fall silent in a specific way when I mentioned a woman friend, not a hostile silence, but a quiet, patient silence that said, "I am waiting for you to hear how this sounds." The way he handled compliments I received from others, he would agree generously, enthusiastically, and then find, usually within the next hour, some small thing to note about whatever I had been complimented on. The dress was beautiful, but maybe a little casual for the occasion. The presentation was great, but I noticed you rushed the last 2 slides, always wrapped in warmth, always deniable, always just helpful enough to make you wonder if you were the problem. I started writing things down. A journal, physical, not digital. A small gray notebook that I kept in my work bag inside a zippered pocket. Not dates and dramatic events, just notes. A sentence here, a sentence there, a record. And when I looked back through those notes after 6 weeks, I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt grateful, not for what had been done to me, for what I could now see. Because you cannot change what you cannot name, and I was finally naming everything. The freelance work continued. Keisha's project led to 2 others. She had recommended me to colleagues, and my name was quietly building a reputation in a circle I had never had access to before. A circle of creative directors and brand consultants who paid rates that still made me feel a little dizzy. I worked evenings, early mornings, lunch breaks. I told Marcus I was catching up on things. He seemed satisfied by the explanation. He had always believed I was not especially ambitious, which I now understood was not an observation, but a shape he had pressed me into over years, and I had taken that shape, and now I was slowly, carefully pressing back against it. I had also, in those months, begun rebuilding the friendships I had allowed to wither. I called Simone every Tuesday on my lunch break, and we talked. Really talked, not the careful edited conversations I had been having where I left out anything that might create friction at home, but real conversations, messy and full of laughter and grief, and the ongoing saga of who we were and who we were trying to become. I reached out to my old friend Dana, who I had not seen in over 2 years, and we met for dinner one night, and she hugged me in the parking lot and said, "I missed you, girl." And I held on to her for longer than I meant to. I reached out to my cousin Rochelle, who had always had a complicated relationship with Marcus. She was too direct, too unwilling to be charmed, and I had allowed her directness to feel like an affront rather than a gift. When I called her, she said, "I was wondering how long it would take." Not with anger, with love. That's the thing about the women who love you. They wait. They stay in the perimeter. They do not stop loving you while you are figuring out how to love yourself again. Marcus noticed none of this. Or if he did, he attributed it to the therapy, which he continued to take credit for in small, subtle ways. "I'm glad you're feeling better," he would say, which positioned him as the context for my wellness rather than a condition I was recovering from. This was, I understood now, very much in keeping with his patterns. He needed to be at the center of everything, including my improvement. Fine. Let him be at the center. I was building a life off to the side, in the margins, in the spaces he didn't think to look, and the life I was building was mine. The thing that finally decided the timeline for me was a Friday night in October, almost 8 months after the text from Keisha. We had friends over for dinner, another couple, James and Lydia, people Marcus had known for years. People I had always found slightly difficult to be honest around because they were so thoroughly in Marcus's orbit that everything they saw passed through him first. We had a lovely dinner, and I made a comment during dessert about a project I was excited about. I let it slip more than I intended to, just a sentence about a campaign I had been working on, and Lydia said, "Oh, are you freelancing now?" And I saw Marcus's face change. It was a micro-expression. Barely there, gone almost before I registered it. But I registered it. And when James and Lydia left, and Marcus was washing the wine glasses with his back to me, he said very casually, "What was that about? The freelance thing?" And I said just as casually, "Just some extra design work, nothing major." And he said, "You didn't mention it to me." And I said, "It's just work, babe. I didn't think it was a big deal." And he turned around and looked at me, and I looked back at him, and something passed between us in that kitchen that I don't have a clean word for. It was the moment, I think, when something in him recognized that something in me had changed. He didn't name it. He put the wine glass down and said, "Okay," and went to bed. But I knew. The clock had started. I gave myself 2 more months. Those 2 months were the most carefully calibrated of my life. I had already, over the preceding months, been laying groundwork that Marcus knew nothing about. I had spoken to an attorney, a woman named Serena Edwards, who a friend of Dr. Wells had quietly recommended, and I understood what the process would look like. I had been documenting financial information, quietly photographing bank statements that came in the mail before Marcus had a chance to file them, building a picture of our finances that I was supposed to know nothing about. I had spoken to my mother, who took it better than I expected. She cried, and then she straightened up and said, "Tell me what you need." And I love her so much for that. I had found an apartment, a small one, just right, in a building with a doorman on the other side of the city, and I had paid the first month and security deposit from my hidden account. I had moved a carefully chosen selection of irreplaceable things, photographs, documents, a few pieces of jewelry that had been my grandmother's, to a box at Simone's apartment. I had told exactly 7 people what was happening, all women, all trusted, all committed to keeping quiet until I was ready. When I told Marcus I wanted a divorce, it was a Sunday morning in December. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and the newspaper. He still read a physical newspaper, which I had always found charming and now found only habitual. And I sat down across from him and I said, "I want to talk to you about something important." And he looked up and I told him. Not with drama, not with a list of accusations. Calmly, clearly, simply, I wanted a divorce. I was not happy. I had not been happy for a long time. I hoped we could handle it with maturity and respect. The silence that followed was the longest I have ever sat inside. I watched him process it. I watched the expressions move through him. Surprise, then something that looked almost like calculation, then the performance of hurt, then something that briefly looked like the real version of hurt, which was harder to watch. And then he said, "Is this about the freelance thing?" And I said, "It's about a lot of things that have built up over a long time." And he said, "I think you should go back to your therapist and talk about this before you make any decisions." And I said, "I've already made the decision." And he said, "Naomi, be reasonable." And I said, "I am being very reasonable." And he looked at me, really looked at me, for a long moment, and I think he saw, perhaps for the first time, that I was not the woman who would change her dress when he suggested it. I was someone else. I had become someone else while he wasn't watching. The divorce took 9 months. Marcus made it difficult in the ways that men like Marcus make things difficult. Not explosive, not dramatic, but procedural, drawn out. He hired a lawyer. He contested things. He delayed. He called my mother twice. He emailed Simone once, which was a tactical error so significant that it galvanized her support of me in a way that even I could not have engineered. He told people things about me that were not true, and some of those people believed him, and that was painful, genuinely painful, in a way I had not anticipated. Because even when you are certain you are right, even when you have done the work and seen the patterns and built the evidence and prepared yourself for every eventuality, it still hurts to have people believe the worst version of you. It still costs you something. I want to be honest about that. But here is what else is true. I had the apartment. I had the account. I had Simone and Dana and Rochelle and my mother and Dr. Wells and Serena and 6 other women who showed up for me in that 9 months in ways that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of. I had the freelance work, which had grown into something real. By the time the divorce was finalized, I had left the agency entirely and was running my own small design consultancy, with 4 steady clients and a reputation that was mine, built in the margins, built in the early mornings and the lunch breaks and the spaces where Marcus had never thought to look. I had a life, a whole, full, complicated, genuinely mine life. And I had built it while he was watching something else. I had built it while letting him believe that he had won. I want to talk for a moment about what healing actually looks like, because I think it is important to be honest about this, because when we tell stories like this one, there is a temptation to end them cleanly, to arrive at a final image of the woman standing in the sunlight, free, whole, healed, the bad chapter behind her. And I am standing in the sunlight. That part is true. But healing is not a destination you reach. It is a practice you return to. There were nights in that first apartment where I sat on my kitchen floor and cried in a way that didn't feel like grief, so much as a body releasing something too large to be named. There were mornings where I questioned everything, not whether I had been right to leave, I never questioned that, but whether I was enough without the structure that his control had provided. Because control, when it is the water you have been swimming in for 6 years, becomes something you have learned to breathe. And learning to breathe actual air again is not always comfortable. It is sometimes terrifying. The freedom to make your own decisions without bracing for a reaction is not immediately exhilarating. It is, at first, disorienting. Like stepping off a treadmill and feeling the ground be stationary under your feet when your whole body expected it to keep moving. I went to therapy every single week for the first year. Dr. Wells became, during that year, one of the most important relationships in my life. She never told me what to think. She never told me how to feel. She asked me questions that made space for me to find my own answers, and she sat with me in the discomfort of the answers I found. And she told me, on a day I remember clearly, "Naomi, The fact that you could see what was happening to you and still have complicated feelings about it. That's not weakness. That's what it means to be human. And I held on to that sentence for a long time, and I still do, on the days when I wonder if I should have seen it sooner, or moved faster, or been braver in ways that I was not. My consultancy is now 3 years old. I have 8 clients, a small team of 2 contractors I bring in for larger projects, and a reputation I am genuinely proud of. I work from a studio apartment. I eventually moved to a larger place, but I kept the studio in my heart as the place where I became myself again, and I think about it with a kind of fierce tenderness. My mother calls me every Sunday morning. Simone and I have standing dinner plans every first Friday of the month. Rochelle and I talk more than we ever did before, which is one of the unexpected gifts of this whole experience. The relationships that came back, fuller and more honest than they had ever been. I have a person I love now, a man I met at one of Keisha's events, a quiet, gentle architect named David who asks me what I think about things and actually listens to the answer and disagrees with me sometimes in the way that people who respect you disagree, openly and without punishment. It took me a long time to trust what he was. It took me a long time to stop bracing for the sigh, the pause, the gentle, devastating redirect. But I got there. Slowly, imperfectly, really. I am telling you this story because someone needs to hear it. Someone is reading this right now and recognizing small things. Not the dramatic things, not the things that show up in movies, but the small things. The dress you changed out of, the friend you stopped calling as often, the professional opportunity that felt too complicated to pursue without a conversation you didn't want to have, the question you wanted to ask about your own bank account and didn't. If you are recognizing those things, I want you to hear me very clearly. You are not imagining it. You are not being too sensitive. You are not the problem. And you do not have to run. You do not have to make a dramatic move before you are ready. You can start small. You can start with a text to a friend, or a search in a private browser, or a journal in a zippered pocket. You can start with one true thing, said quietly to yourself. Something is wrong. That sentence, small, private, yours, can be the beginning of everything. What Marcus never understood, and what I want to say directly because I think it matters, he thought control was power. He thought that by making himself the center of every decision, by slowly and carefully narrowing the world I moved through, he was building something. He was building his position, his importance, his indispensability. He thought that if I couldn't order from a menu without his guidance, I couldn't exist without him. And for a long time, he was right. Not because I lacked capability, but because I had been taught to doubt it. But here is what he didn't account for. The same intelligence that I had been quietly redirecting toward pleasing him, that same careful attention to patterns and details, that same capacity to read a room and anticipate needs, all of that, when I turned it on myself, turned out to be extraordinary. When I pointed those skills at my own liberation instead of his comfort, I became someone he had never prepared for. I became someone who watched and waited and built and planned and moved at exactly the right moment, while he was still standing in the kitchen looking at a glass he didn't know was already empty. He thought he had won because I let him think it. I let him think it because I needed time, and because I was building, and because the most powerful thing I ever did in that marriage was not the day I left. The most powerful thing I ever did was the day I decided to stay long enough to leave right. If this story found you today, I don't believe that's an accident. I believe stories find the people who need them. And if this one found you, I want to know, what is the small thing that you have been noticing? What is the question you haven't let yourself ask yet? Leave it in the comments if you are ready, or just sit with it. Either way, you have already taken the first step just by watching this far, just by letting someone else's truth bump up against your own and feeling what happens when it does. That feeling, whatever it is, recognition, discomfort, relief, grief, honor it. It's telling you something important. My name is Naomi Carter. I let my husband believe he won for 4 months while I built a life he knew nothing about. And then I walked out of that kitchen, and I have been walking forward ever since. And I am here, and I am whole, and I am still becoming the woman who was always in there, waiting. If she is in there waiting for you too, I hope this story helped her feel a little less alone. If you made it to the end of this, thank you. That means something to me, genuinely. If you connected with any part of what I shared, please leave a comment below. It doesn't have to be long. It can be one word. It can be something you've never said out loud before. This is a safe space, and I read every single one. And if you think someone in your life needs to hear this story, a friend, a sister, a cousin, someone you've been quietly worried about, please share it. You never know which story is the one that finally makes something click. Subscribe if you want to stay in this conversation with me, because there is so much more I want to talk about. About rebuilding trust, about dating after coercive control, about what it means to build a career on your own terms when you have spent years being told what your terms should be. I'm just getting started, and I'm glad you're here.